G'day, everybody. I'm going to talk to you about a project that we've been working on over the last year or so for FWPA, particularly looking at methyl bromide and methyl bromide alternatives for Australian log export. I'll talk for like 15 minutes or so, and then we'll have questions at the end. I personally work for Vesica Research, so we're a private research organisation based out of Melbourne, Victoria, but we're also associated with La Trobe University as well in Victoria. All right. So those of you unaware, for Australian log export, about 80% of all the softwood logs that we export are going to India and China as of 2025. India is by far the largest market, followed by China. And both of these markets require that Australian logs are pre-treated with an approved phytosanitary treatment. The reason why countries ask for this, it's basically a biosecurity concern for them. So, for example, they don't want Australian insect pests arriving in their country, so they want those logs to be treated to ensure that they are controlled before they get there. Methyl bromide has been the standard treatment for many years. It's the absolute sort of gold standard that's been used for a long time for log export. I've got here a big table. You don't need to look at the whole thing. I just wanted to point out that for India and China, there are a few options, but the realistic options that industry can use really is just methyl bromide. If you look at India, you've got their methyl bromide. It pops up a few times. It's just the rate is changing depending on the temperature. But for India, basically the approved treatments you can use is methyl bromide and heat treatment. I've got a column there for cost. It's a very rough cost basis. It's sort of the cost of the product. You've got many other costs on top of that, but you can see, generally speaking, treatments like heat or even bark removal are more expensive than methyl bromide. China is a little bit different. It does accept sulfuryl fluoride as well, which is a potential alternative for industry. But currently, as it stands, it is still more expensive. So industry is continuing to use methyl bromide more often than not to go to China. All that being said, apart from it being one of the few approved treatments, the reason why it's been there for so long is because we know it's incredibly effective at killing pests. Methyl bromide really is incredibly good at penetrating logs and killing pests within them. So it's very effective, and it's been around for a long time. The downside is that it also degrades ozone, and you can imagine that this environmental issue can be a big problem. And for those who are unaware, basically in the 90s, Australia signed up to the Montreal Protocol. The protocol includes all the major countries, and essentially the idea here is that we would work towards reducing our methyl bromide use. Now, since we signed up, Australia's total methyl bromide use has actually gone up. We're now, I think, the fourth largest user of methyl bromide in the world. And that's because we've been using more and more for our quarantine and pre-shipment. So, for example, for pre-shipment of export logs has actually gone up over time. We have phased out all non-quarantine and pre-shipment use, and that's happened essentially worldwide. And that's now putting, you can imagine, extra pressure on Australia from a political point of view to sort of start to look at, potentially reducing our use for quarantine and export purposes. So that falls under log export. Now, that issue has been around for a long time. Like I mentioned, we phased out on non-QPS in roughly 2005. There was a little bit left over in a few select industries, but the bulk of it did go away, a couple of decades ago. And that pressure has been there ever since. But there's actually additional pressures now on methyl bromide use. And that comes from internally with regulatory agencies. So, for example, Safe Work Australia has announced that as of December next year, they're actually going to change the time-weighted average value of methyl bromide. Now, that might not mean much to the audience, but practically how that's used at the moment, for example, is after they vent like a treatment area of logs, They have handheld devices and they're waiting for it to get to 5 ppm to say the treatment is over. At the bare minimum, that's likely going to change to 1 ppm to keep up to date with these numbers. It could mean additional things, though. APVMA, which is the Australian Registry Agency that sort of puts in place what's on the labels, they'll have to look at these numbers and decide what else it could mean for methyl bromide use. Ultimately, we'll have to wait until it gets closer to this date to see what happens. But industry is fearful that perhaps we might go down the same route as what occurred in New Zealand. So, for example, in New Zealand, they also had a re-review of methyl bromide from their regulatory body. And the big change that happened, there was quite a few things, but a really big impact is a change to buffer zones. So a buffer zone is the distance from the log stack or the ship, for example. If we were doing the same fumigations in New Zealand, we'd be facing, buffer zones of up to 500 or 700 meters if they were going to China. At the moment, in reality, we're talking a couple of meters. So everything we do, all the operations, they wouldn't be practical. You couldn't do it. It just wouldn't happen. And you could imagine that when this came into effect in New Zealand, that essentially as soon as it legally came into effect, all the methyl bromide use dropped off. And if that happened to Australia, the big risk, of course, is that we lose access to those markets that require methyl bromide. So we wouldn't be able to ship to India and China. Now, realistically, the situation is uncertain. So whether or not those regulations will come into place, we don't know. But you can imagine with these growing pressures, industry is interested in looking at methyl bromide alternatives so that they are set up and safeguarded if there were to be a major change. And that's where we come in. We've been working on this for the last year, and I'll talk a bit more about what we're doing now as well. But essentially, we worked with a major exporter out of Portland, as well as their clients. There were a few different objectives of the project. We were interested initially in looking at one particular alternative, which was methyl iodide. This is just because we had a background working with this chemical from a soil treatment point of view, but we were honestly very interested in looking at quite a number of alternatives. Things like ethanedinitrile and sulfuryl fluoride are really top contenders as potential alternatives. I'll talk a bit more about them in a moment, but both of those products are already registered for use. But nonetheless, we wanted to basically review all of the alternatives and identify if there are any major gaps that should be addressed in future so that they are, viable and they are there to be used by industry and adopted if need be. In terms of our trials, we just did a few commercial fumigations with methyl iodide down in Portland. So we're making these small stacks that are a smaller version of what they're doing down there at the moment. Methyl iodide is very similar to methyl bromide chemically. It's registered in Japan for treatment of wood products, but it's not registered in Australia at the moment for treatment of wood products. So the data we collected from these experiments will go towards helping for registration potentially in future. Here's an example of some of the insect pests we were trying to kill. The center grub there, that's actually Cyrex wood wasp. So we were basically able to show that we killed these pests with roughly 30 grams per cubic meter. And there's a rough cost there of product cost, for example. The reason we were focused on pests like Cyrex is because it's a key pest for India. So the pests that we're selecting, they're going to be of concern to those key trading partners. Okay, but I mentioned it's not just methyl iodide. Realistically, methyl iodide is what we would call a medium-term option. So it's probably not going to be available for several years because you just need more data in order to get it registered first in Australia and then accepted by those trading partners. More short-term options include sulfuryl fluoride and EDN, so ethanedinitrile. There's quite a lot of data on these products, and we were looking at what are the major gaps. And really one of the big gaps that was identified, particularly for these two, is getting them accepted by those trading partners. So India doesn't currently accept either of these products, And that's a big hurdle that would need to be overcome if industry was going to have them as viable options. So overall, in our, basically a year into the project, we got good data on methyl iodide, which is great and will help towards registration in the future. We also were able to speak with a lot of exporters and fumigators around the country. And this was really good because we basically bring them up to speed on what's going on and getting their opinion on the viability of the different alternatives from a practical standpoint. And of course, we also put together a pathway for industry to decide what they might want to invest in and what experiments need to be done to get these alternatives over the line. And I'll just briefly mention before we go to questions what we're looking at now. So currently, right now, we've just started a new project, and basically the aim of this project is to fill those gaps. So the methyl iodide, it's quite straightforward. So we're going to look at key pests for India and do greater replication of those experiments that we've already started. We also want to do large-scale trials, potentially fumigation of ships with EDN or sulfuryl fluoride. And really the key to getting these trials done is that we want them to count towards getting acceptance by India. And to do that, a really big breaching gap that we need to overcome is really big extension activities where we'll get everybody in the room together. So not just exporters and forestry companies, but also the chemical companies, representatives of DAF, key individuals who are important to trade, as well as Department of Environment potentially as well. And we need this in order to really push everybody together to help get those treatments over the line so that we can have really meaningful discussions with counterparts in India, for example. And before we go to questions, I just want to mention that we did look at quite a few other alternatives as well. So if there's any questions related to, say, phosphine use or any other chemicals, please don't hesitate to ask, because we did look at quite a number of options. We just had a few key alternatives that were sort of ahead in different categories, and that's why we've got more focus on them going forwards. Okay, thank you very much.